I'm going to tie up a popular little panfish fly. This is called the SMP. However, I call this one a smallmouth SMP. The SMP is a video, actually it's a fly that I did a video on a while back. I'll have a link in the description for you as well as in the video here. The SMP is a panfish fly, and it was created by a gentleman by the name of Skip Morris. SMP stands for Skip Morris Panfish. Years ago, when I ran across this and started fishing the SMP, I needed a version that would do real well with the smallmouth we have in our streams, and would help mimic some small shad minnows that we have that are only about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. So looking at the pattern, I just made it all white and gold, essentially is it. So it's a white thread underbody with white floss on it, gold ribbon, gold eyes, some epoxy originally just to help protect it, and white Marabou. And this has been a extremely effective fly for panfish as well as smallmouth. I've caught some very large 20-inch plus smallmouth on this little fly. It has been very, very productive. Another good variation of this is keeping it all the same, but after you put the white in, put just a little bit of pink on it, and it becomes a very, very effective white bass fly, which this one still works very well, but I think adding a little pink is also very good for the white bass. So I call it the smallmouth SMP. That's the fly that I'm going to tie today, and I'll get started. So I've got my hook in the vise for the smallmouth SMP fly. This is a 3906B in a size 6. I like a nice heavy wire hook on this. You want to go for a larger minnow imitation and tie this a little bit larger, certainly you can. This is for some of the shiners that we have in our local streams that are anywhere from about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. That's what I'm kind of targeting with this, so I'm going with the heavier wire hook to help when this gets hung up on rocks and things. For thread, I'm going to use, this is a UTC 140 Denier in white. You could go with a 210 Denier, and I'll explain a little bit more in a minute, but I find that the 140 does a good enough job. I wouldn't go with much smaller, and you'll see in a second. Attach my thread along the hook shank. I want to tie in these eyes. I'm using some Bead-Chain eyes for this. You could use some dumbbell eyes if you want. It's going to sink a little faster. I think this sinks well enough and gets down near the bottom, not quite on the bottom. I'm using a extra large. This is a 3/16 size gold bead for this, and I want to keep those beads about an eye length behind the actual eye of the hook. I want to have just a little bit of room in between those Bead-Chain eyes and behind the eye of the hook, because we're going to tie in some Marabou on this side here, and I need a little extra room for navigating some thread around the front portion of those beads and behind the eye of the hook. You shall see in just a moment. I'm going to anchor those in real well with a few crisscross wraps, some wraps underneath to secure them. I'm going to bring my thread back down to almost the end of the shank. It's going to be a very secure fly, but just to help it while I'm tying here, I'm going to put just a little bit of head cement on there. For a rib, I'm using a Danville oval gold tinsel. This is a size 10, a little bit larger size tinsel. Tie this in bringing the end of that all the way up to just behind the eyes there. And I'm going to come down just a little bit down the bend here. The overall body on this is actually built up with some thread, but on top of that, I'm going to put some floss on this, and I'm using this is a Danville's Rayon 4-strand floss in white, using all 4 strands here. I'm going to attach that and also bring the ends back right up to those beads there. As I attach that, I'm going to come down the bend just a few wraps to secure that in, and then come back up the hook shank. Now I'm going to start to bind in the floss and the tinsel and creating my underbody. This is where a larger size thread might come in handy. Using a 210 size thread, I can build this up much quicker than with this 140. But at the same time, the 140 is not bad. First thing I want to do is I'm going to smooth all of this out. And that's just going back and forth on it and putting a little extra here and there where it's needed, and not putting some where it's not needed. Like right here, I got a little bit of a dip, so I'm going to put a little extra right there. I'm going to come back and taper this a little bit to the back end, coming forward. And then as I come up here, now when I go back down, I'm not going to go the full length down to the end. I'm just going to go to about the point of the hook, come back up, and then back down again, but not quite even to the point of the hook. This is just going to build up an underbody here. Again, if you want, use a 210. You can even use a flat wax nylon or something that's going to be much thicker, that you can accomplish this a lot quicker. It's up to you. But we want to give this just a little bit of a minnow taper right here. And once you have it there, you could, if you wanted to, go all the way down and then flatten the thread just a little bit as you come back up, but I just go down and up, making certain I've got most of those grooves filled in. As you're going to see here in a minute, it's not important to have this totally smooth. 2 reasons why. One, we're going to use this floss on here, which will fill in some of those grooves and everything. And 2, we're going to reinforce the floss body and the rib with some UV resin. Now I'm just going to take that floss and start to wrap that in to cover all that up, get it nice and smooth, and then I'll put my rib in. Putting the rib in, I like to get one complete wrap right here at the back before I start to open that spiral up. And then I don't get too hung up on making certain I have just 5 wraps or 6 wraps or whatever. Put a little bit tighter wrap in there for more segmentation if that's what you want, or a little bit less. I think either way, as long as they're fairly even, I think that works out just fine. Now I'm going to move my thread forward to the front half here, because now I'm going to use some UV resin to reinforce this. Panfish and bass, which are what this is targeting, really, really sharp abrasive teeth. Now, smaller ones, it's not so bad, but the bigger ones, they definitely can chew some things up. This floss in here will get chewed up really, really quick. So I'm using some Solar Res. This is some Solar Res Ultra Thin. In the old days when I first made this, when I first came up with this pattern years ago, and as I mentioned, it's not really my pattern, it's a Skip Morris panfish fly variant. But when I first developed it, I would tie the fly up to this point like this, and I would anchor my thread and take it off, and I would actually put some epoxy on here and put it on a turner. That's one thing you can do, but with the UV material, it just cures instantly, so you don't have to take your thread off, and we can just proceed. This particular Solar Res UV material also cures tack-free, which is important. So I'm going to put some on here, and this is just, like I said, as a protection. It's a safeguard against sharp teeth. I don't necessarily want to build this up. That's why I'm using a super thin. I'm not wanting to necessarily build up a bulky, body or anything. I just want to protect it. As a matter of fact, if I get a little bit too much right in here, I'm just going to go ahead and take some of that extra UV off. If you want, you can take your bodkin. As you can see, right above this eye, I have a little bit too much. Just take your bodkin and set it in there and pull it back through, and you'll take some of that extra UV material out of there. I don't want it piled up in between those eyes because, as you'll see in a minute, we're going to have a bunch of thread wraps getting some Marabou anchored down in there. I'm just covering all of that up. And then I will hit it with a torch. And now all of that is cured. So that is all taken care of. It's not tacky. We're set to go. The only other material in the Smallmouth SMP is some Marabou. I'm using some white Marabou for this. I like a fairly full Marabou plume. And again, I'm looking for a bait fish that's going to be anywhere from 1 to 1.5 inches. This is almost 1 inch right now. So you could tie this in so that the Marabou is the length of the whole hook, or I go just a little bit extra. It's going to be anchored down in here, so when all of this is said and done, you're going to have this anchored here, and it's going to be just a little bit longer off the back. I find the easiest way to do this is to collect all of this together, leave the excess on for now, set it up here, and we're going to crisscross wrap right around the Bead-Chain eyes and across the front here. And I'm going to get about 3 wraps on both sides. Then I'll trim away the excess Marabou. Wet your fingers or get a little moisture on your fingers, and you can moisten that Marabou a little bit to get it out of the way. Now it's just a process of crisscross wraps down here to anchor all these butt ends in. One thing I like to do, let's just say I'm going to put in 3 cross wraps right here, now I have to go to the other side. Well, I could come straight under behind those eyes and then put those wraps in. But what that's going to do for me is I'm going to start to build up some thread right across the very back here. And I don't want to do that. I want to minimize that. I just want a V right up in here where the thread's coming across right by those eyes pointing up towards the front. So in order to keep from having to do that, after I get my wrap in on this direction, to switch over to the other direction, I'm going to wrap once around the front of those Bead-Chain eyes and the eye of the hook, and then come across from back to front on the other side. Then I can wrap right around here to change direction again. The idea here is we're going to go back and forth on each side, securing all of that Marabou in and making it so that there's no loose Marabou hanging out and building up in between these eyes. And when we're done, like I said, I have a nice V that points forward here. I don't have a lot of thread wraps straight across the back there. So once I get all of that anchored down up here, I'll then use my thread to just taper this down to the eye of the hook, come back up inside there a little bit, and now we'll get a whip finish in. Careful, sometimes that will happen. My thread just popped right down. Hold on. I lost my thread tension there, and that's what happened. Thread tension is always very important. That way your thread's going right where you want it to go. So take a little more care. Now I get my thread from the back towards the front, and I get a 4 or 5 turn whip finish in there, and that just smooths off, tapering that head right down to the eye of the hook. Cut away my thread. Again, a little moisture gets that Marabou going backwards. I don't have to worry about head cement right now because I'm going to use some more UV resin. The UV resin is not only going to protect these thread wraps here, but as this bounces on the bottom on rocks and things like this, it protects all this thread from getting chewed up and falling apart. So once again, we're going to go back to the solar res. And I'm just going to start putting a little on. I don't want to build up a lot. You could, with the epoxy, you could actually even build up a substantial head of epoxy around the eyes and everything else to kind of smooth it off. And the panfish SMP is kind of built that way. It just tapers it a little bit, almost like a bonefish bitters. You just taper it down a little bit. But I find if I just get enough on there to cover that up. Now I'm going to rotate this just a little bit. You can see why I took the UV resin right behind those eyes, why I cleaned that out when I first coated the body, because we had a lot of thread wraps to put in there to anchor down the Marabou so it just sits right on the top. All I'm doing here is rotating it back and forth a little bit, making certain it all is evenly distributed and not drooped one way. And once I'm happy with it, I'll get the torch out. The stuff cures very, very quick. It tends to be a little bit more brittle than epoxy, at least I have found. But certain applications like this, it's kind of nice because you can get things done a little bit quicker. Again, if I were doing this in epoxy, I would have done all of these to this point. I'd have to put it into the vise, reattach my thread, do the Marabou on there, get everything tied off, detach my thread, do a dozen of them, then one by one put them into the vise, get some epoxy on them, put them into a turner, then they all turn, they do their thing. It's just a little bit more drawn out process. Still fun, still interesting, but that is one advantage to the UV resins. They can make some of that a little bit quicker. So that is our completed smallmouth SMP. I'm going to turn this over in the vise so that You can see this is how this is actually going to be in the water. It is a very, very effective fly. I've had really, really good results with this for the smallmouth panfish and white bass in our local streams. So there's the smallmouth SMP. Thanks for watching today. Thanks for joining me at Devise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.